You're in for a treat just from my having read Neil's book, and I will try to summarize in, say, 3 sentences or so what I think is the central message of your book, and then you can correct me and tell me how I got it wrong. But as far as I understand it, Neil is trying to understand and explain what's essential about being human, but in the context of the changes that have been introduced into society and into our understanding of ourselves from artificial intelligence. So in the context of developments in artificial intelligence. So that, stating that difference is a key part of the book. So what is the difference? Again, this is going to be very brief, but I would say my understanding is that there are many different kinds of intelligence. Machine intelligence is very different from human intelligence, and what it is to be human has more to do with our embodiment and our culture and the history of both of those. The fact that our bodies have an evolutionary history and our culture has a history as well. And those differences mean that the kinds of intelligence that are in machines now, at least, and for the near future, it's very different from what human minds are made of. And then he doesn't stop there, but then he looks at, well, so what? What does that mean? What does that imply, these differences? And he goes into a lot of detail about, mainly, I would say, the dangers of not recognizing those differences, but also just the differences themselves, what that means in terms of how we should be using these AI systems, how we should not be using them, and some dangers that we should avoid, and a little bit of some opportunities that we might have because of these differences. So how's that for a summary? Correct that, and that will be our starting off point.
Yeah, that's good. And I guess in some sense, I think that was a great summary. And I suppose another way of putting it is, but the idea that the notion of machine intelligence just creates a place to stand and look back at us and actually enjoy ourselves in terms of what our intelligence is. And at the heart of that, I think, is the notion, and you mentioned it in terms of the embodiment, but at the heart of the book is actually the idea that what defines our intelligence is not our capabilities, but our vulnerabilities and our limitations. To me, I find that, I'm not religious myself, but actually, through doing this type of stuff, I've got a lot of admiration for what a lot of religious movements can do at their best. And for me, that's a sort of substitution for that in some sense, an admiration for what we are and what we achieve, what we can do despite those limitations. And so in some sense, the book, I suppose, is a bit of a homage to the human, but then, as you said, that there's the consequences of that those limitations stem from, our embodiment. But one of the ways we overcome them is through culture. And then you suddenly realize the preciousness of this culture we've inherited. And the people that in effect died for us to have these lessons that are with us today, and how easily we seem to potentially discard them.
Quite rightly, these you do emphasize the limitations of human embodiment, and you have this notion of the embodiment factor, which you define. The book is not full of equations. I can reassure you. But the concept of this embodiment factor is equation-like in that it's looking at it's a way of expressing for any given system, whether it's a human or a machine, how much is going on on the inside, say computationally, versus what the bandwidth is between that system and its conspecifics or fellow humans or fellow machines or whatever. And Neil notes that we have a very particular embodiment factor in that there's a lot going on inside, as you might agree yourself, but language is our primary way of communicating, is very low bandwidth. And that's very different from how the machines we have right now are. And so that limitation, that embodiment factor, plays a role throughout the book. So can you say a little bit more about that particular aspect of embodiment, that particular limitation? You mentioned culture, but what implications does that have for who we are as humans and our differences from machines?
Yeah, and So I have a way of explaining it that I sometimes use in talks that isn't the way in the book. So, I mean, I'm communicating by speaking, and that speaking, what you're hearing, what you're picking up is sound waves. And electromagnetic radiation travels 1 million times faster than the speed of sound. So if we were to communicate with each other using exactly the same way of speaking, but directly through electromagnetic waves, so that you could pick it up, you had like a Wi-Fi receiver in your head, that would mean that we would immediately be going 1 million times faster, right? So our ability to communicate with each other would be 1 million times faster. Now, when you look at how fast two machines can communicate with each other, they're using 10 gigabit per second Ethernet. And when you do a rough calculation, what they're actually doing is they're going 300 million times faster than us. So if you want to get a sense of the communication rate, the difference between our communication rate, 1-to-1, and the machines, it's a factor of 300 million. That's the difference between walking pace and speed of light. This is important because from a scientific perspective, information is very well defined. It's a very fundamental idea. And indeed, there's some people who think that you can redefine the whole of physics through information. Whereas the notion of intelligence isn't. It's very poorly defined, actually. And it's one of these things, like the analogy I use in the book, is it's like the word obscenity or beauty. We know it when we see it, but actually defining it, in sort of rigid terms is something that, one will know, cognitive science has sort of looked at. It's hard to define it, but we all have a sense of what it is. Whereas information is very different. You can rank information, you can stack it. It's like energy or temperature or these sort of things like this. And that difference in information communication rate is fundamental to these machines and has been pretty much fundamental to them, not since quite the beginning because they didn't have the communication protocols, but certainly for the last 20 years. And one of the things that I find immensely irritating is the sort of notion that the troubles we're facing with these technologies are new and imminent, rather than they're already present through that dislocation, through that sort of information asymmetry. So when you look at things like social media, where you have machines that don't understand us in the way we understand each other, but that can look at vast quantities of our data and know how to push our buttons. Not in the way that we push each other's buttons, but just going, well, look, you can see that they do this. If you show them material that confirms their beliefs, they like it. They'll suck that up. Whoever they think they are, you can make them worse than they are. The machines have seen that. And that's been going on for the last sort of 20 years of social media. And that's really at the heart of what we're experiencing, which is an information revolution. What's happening now is the nature of that information revolution is shifting because the machines have seen enough of our data that they are finally able to start communicating on our terms. They've absorbed enough of our culture that it becomes possible for them to understand our intent when we're having a conversation like this, which is a very, very new and interesting thing, but which has generated a lot of excitement around the technology. But one of my fears is it's ignoring this fundamental thing that's behind it all, of this communication asymmetry between us and the machine. That means our intelligence is, as I put it in the book, it's a locked-in intelligence. So you compare us to the example I use in the book, Jean-Dominique Bauby, someone who can only wink to communicate. He's communicating 300 times slower than I am now by winking to communicate. But the machine is going 300 million times faster. So the difference between us and someone who's locked in and winking is the difference between walking pace and speed of sound. But the difference between us and the machine is the difference between walking pace and speed of light. And, I think as soon as you get that, actually just that single fact is sufficient to, I think, utterly change the way you think about the machine.
I think you'd agree that what's going on inside is also substantially different. So it's not just that the machine's got the same kind of stuff going on inside and the same quantity or the same hierarchy of semantic meaning that we do. It's just that it can also communicate this much faster. There seems to be, it's exacerbated by the fact that it's a kind of a shallow kind of meaning that's present inside. Whereas we have, because of that limitation, we've developed these quite sophisticated, nuanced, rich, meaningful structures due to our embodiment, due to our enculturation, that a machine wouldn't even they don't even have that. Or am I mischaracterizing?
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I think because, of course, there's communication, but then there's having something to say, as Ron put the embodiment factor. Like,
thank you. That was a much nicer way of saying it.
There's the thing of having to say is we're all sitting there having thoughts, and we choose to share some of those thoughts. So, of course, characterizing thoughts is hard, but if we try and characterize them in terms of computation, how much it would take to simulate a human brain, then you get answers that it would take quite a large supercomputer, not the new Met Office computer, but the old one, I think, could roughly do it. We don't know how it works, as Ron sort of knows. We can't do that. We actually don't understand the brain well enough to simulate it. But if we did understand it and you wanted to simulate one, you'd need a pretty hefty machine. So in some sense, you could argue that there's more computation in our heads than there is in a typical machine. So while we have a limited ability to communicate, there's an enormous amount going on inside. It's sort of like we're a Formula One engine in terms of power, but we've only got spindly little bicycle wheels to deploy the power on the track, right? But whereas the machine is like a go-kart. It's sort of got a go-kart engine, but it's got fat go-kart tires. And so the way in which we approach moving around is utterly different, because actually a lot of it becomes about how we deploy, what we choose to deploy. And that's where culture and what Ron was sort of highlighting, that's where the richness of humanity comes in, because we can use, first of all, shared human experience to communicate. Just by, if I go like that, then you might think I'm talking about eating, right? I don't have to sort of describe the process of how a human eats, because you have the same experience, so I can rely on that. But then what you see over time is that builds into our culture. So there are things that are less physical, are less about, our bodily function, but more associated with shared human experience in ways that sort of lift us in interesting ways. Literature being a very interesting one. If I say Robinson Crusoe, we're all somewhere, right? Or if I say Gulliver's Travels, we're all somewhere again. And each of us might know more or less about that. But we have these shared concepts that gives this immense richness. So that becomes a sort of a substrate in which our intelligence operates. And, one of the things I sometimes say to be provocative, because what you see at the moment, a lot of the voices that are dominating the conversations, they're the sort of people who, they're so egotistical that they think it's about their brain and who they are and their individual capabilities, which is, and fundamentally a deeply eugenic idea, and we've had difficulty with that in the past, and we're seeing it rising again. When the truth is, they of course are part of a wider ecosystem, but it's their ability to also interact with that cultural ecosystem. So sometimes I like to say, just to provoke them, the seat of human intelligence is actually in our culture, not in your head. Now, of course, it's obviously in both. But it's a provocation that, if you want to find human intelligence, look in our culture. Don't look in any individual. Those individuals will die, right? But the culture will live on, and that's how information and knowledge is passed on.
It seems to me that you have a kind of a double whammy against the idea of machines understanding us. So they give the appearance of understanding us to some people, at least. We can apparently have conversations, but they're not. I think you would agree that that you say that they're not really understanding us. But it's actually worse than that. It's like even if they were the kind of things that could understand in some sense, they would have a trouble understanding us because we have this different embodiment factor.
I mean, towards the end of the book, I try and say what's going on is that they've emulated something that looks like us, right? So by reading everything they've ever written and playing the game of guess the next word, they've had to, inside the machine, reconstruct states that are analogous to states that humans use to communicate, which is an extraordinary thing. And I think it's very exciting and very interesting. And to sort of clarify what I mean by that, the example I use in the book is the Moniac was an analog computer. It's got water in it, and it was built to model the British economy. And there's one in the Science Museum. But there were like 14 made in the 1940s. And the idea was you had a sort of tank, and that's how much money there is in the treasury. And then you change interest rates and you move valves. And
I thought you were going to say flush it down. Though.
You flush it, yeah. Yeah, and the whole of Britain is flushed down the... No, there's some really good...
I interrupted your flow there.
No, but it's something, every time I look at I always say this is a model of the British economy, although I sometimes look at it, it looks more robust than the British economy. But the idea is that water flows, money flows. That's an analogy. who here knew that's where analog computing comes from? That's what the term means, right? So you're computing by an analogy. Because water can flow and money can flow, I can set up a sort of set of flows where I can sort of say the level of this tank is the amount of money in the treasury, even though, it's water, and there is no treasury. There's no sort of smorg sitting on a pile of gold. But but these analogies work because the sort of physics of the things work. So that's called an analog computer. And then, of course, we move to digital computers, which ironically, at their core, have an analogy that allows them to use logic. The electrons move in certain ways that allows them to do logic, and then you construct maths, and then you stop using analog computers because these things are more flexible. But if you want to think about what we've created in terms of these AIs, as Ron was sort of saying, they don't feel and understand in the way we do because they don't have our experience and our direct experience, our vulnerabilities, the fact that we're going to die, the fact that we can lose people who are closest, the fact that we love, the fact that we can lose professional reputation, that we can fall ill. All of these things are part of our lived experience that a machine can never have. Or, and when we say it's imagining having it, well, it's emulating that experience by looking at what we've written about it, right? So in order to emulate that really accurately, it inside has states that are analogous to those feelings we have. So because it's seeing so much data and it has these analogous states, it can produce extraordinary pieces of textual work that I could never write. But just be very clear that to the extent that is human, that's coming from the humans it's read. The lived experiences it's distilled and is now regurgitating. It's not having those experiences itself. And of course, it's an utterly extraordinary thing, but as Ron said, it's not understanding and operating in the same way we do, exposed to all these risks. And when we're imagining things, you imagine just the loss of a child, I just find the most extraordinary, unimaginable thing, right? And any one of you thinking about that, you will feel the same. My skin goes crawly, everything goes, right? And how can a machine ever think about that, right? Or the consequence of that in some sense, as human beings, we wish for the loss of our parents over the loss of ourselves. Maybe not individually and maybe not in the moment, but that's a better thing. It's a better thing to see your parents die because that means they're not seeing you die. Right? That is mind-blowing, and I think that all resonates in certain ways because you all have lived experiences that will be different in every one of us and will differ according to your life experience, right? And that's human intelligence, right? It is extraordinary what the machine can do and that it can reflect that. It can write things that will move people, in all sorts of ways. But it's different. It's fundamentally different. And the preciousness of what we have, I think, is the thing that we need to keep front and center.
I don't know about you all, but I find myself nodding and in agreement with a lot of what you say. So I'm going to feebly perhaps try to introduce some tension here and maybe take devil's advocate position for just a second, although I think I can probably anticipate that you're going to resolve it in a way that I'll start nodding again. But let me try. Devil's advocate, someone might say, you're saying that a lot of the difference between us and machines comes from these limitations. Yeah. You die, or the embodiment factor, limited bandwidth. Well, couldn't we just make things worse for machines then? Lower their bandwidth and make them the kind of things that they might have a limited lifespan or something. If it's just a matter of these negatively characterizing our differences from machines, and it seems like we can just make the machines have fewer advantages and make them more like us in order to make machines that could understand us or be understandable by us.
No, and I think it's an interesting way of thinking, and I think, I think of it as like the simulant argument. It's what they do in Blade Runner. The interesting thing about it is I think it is an interesting thing to talk about, but it's a fundamentally different thing from what we're talking about with AI, because what it requires is it actually starts getting close to cloning. Because in some sense, what it sort of requires you to do is, but what if we didn't tell the computer it had access to all this sort of thing? And what if we faked its memories? Which is what they do in Blade Runner, yeah. And it's like, well, sure, but now what's the point in doing that? So now you're creating, there's really fun ways to create human beings.
I think I know what you have in mind.
So it's not, so me, and I'm not denying that there might be some reason, But I don't know what the reason is, and the last thing I want to do is put us in a way to dictate that that's what we're going to do. I mean, that seems like a terrible idea. Even our ability to predict what the world was going to look like 20 years ago was appalling. And if we'd made decisions about how we should preempt the world of today 20 years ago, they would have all been appalling decisions. And a lot of what we get into with these arguments is like that. So I do think it's I think that there's a way of arguing you could create something that wasn't human but wouldn't know, and that's maybe, but there's a sort of question as to why, and it also actually gets closer to arguments around cloning and life generation, which is not something I look at in the book. And I think if you really want to look at things which are potentially disturbing, there are lots of things in the biospace, including life extension. The fact that we die is how human society progresses, and the fact that powerful people die is a vital part of the way human society progresses, right? And so the idea that the powerful suddenly gain access to technologies to extend life, if people want to worry about dystopias, I think that's a good one. Yes, it's clearly that you can argue that, but I think it's a different thing from what we're saying we're creating, right, which is this sort of notion of an all-powerful entity that, I don't think it knows things in the way we know things, but presumably has, if it's all-powerful in this way, is aware that it is doing these sort of things differently.
Well, you talk about the importance of grounding for human intelligence and cognition, and that's one of the things I like about the book is that, yes, you have a little bit of a horizon, but you're saying, look, the technologies we have that are of this kind are limited in this way, and you go into detail about, they're different, let's say. They're different in this way. And in sometimes it's because they're unlimited or less limited. You're obviously not a Luddite, but on the other hand, you're not this kind of utopian who says, it's all going to be great. The more AI that's out there, the better. The more technology that's out there, the better. And in particular, you aren't obsessed with AGI. There's very little discussion of superintelligence in the book. And if anything, there's a criticism of that notion. It says, how do you even put intelligence on a single scale that you can say that this thing is more intelligent than a human? So, maybe you would want to. What about that? Have I got right about you? And what have I got wrong about you?
I guess what I probably attack, and you can correct my because I might get the lingo wrong. I think I'm attacking analytic philosophy quite heavily, particularly in terms of its application to societal consequences. And it's quite interesting because the people who are most famous for this, people like Nick Bostrom, who make these claims and write these books, when you challenge them on societal implications, the type of quote he sort of says, that's above my pay grade, that's far too complex, right? And it's like, so stop talking about it as if what you're saying is relevant, because fundamentally it isn't, because there's a bunch of practical reasons, as with any analytic framework. And
who's going to talk about it if not the philosophers? We thought that's they. No,
I think I'm very. But actually, one of the things, and I'm not super up on philosophy, but from what I've understood and from what I've read, I'm becoming increasingly embracing of the more Aristotelian sort of approaches to these things, and the sense that actually, I don't know, which I feel has a lot more qualia in it and tries to be less rational. I think one of the problems, the book is a reductive book, right? The book is reductive about the notions of intelligence, because it basically says the notion of the atomic human. So I should say what that idea is. That it's a Greek philosophical idea around the physical world, that if I take something and I cut it in two, and then I cut that in two, and then I take a quarter and cut that in two, do I get to the point where I get to nothing, or do I have to get to a point where I can't cut? But they were philosophers, so obviously they didn't try and cut anything. They just thought about it. And they sort of thought, probably there would be a point where you wouldn't cut. And then they said atomus, right, Democritus. And then, of course, that notion got handed to the physicists who did try and cut it and went and split the atom. Take that notion, apply it to our cognitive world. And if every time the machine does something that we used to say is uniquely ours, so... and I think the early interesting ones, which people thought and wrote a lot about, like Samuel Butler, is like the steam engine was able to do things that up until then people thought of as specifically human. I'm down in Brighton for a few days, and I'm going to head to the Brighton Engineerium for the first time in since I was 8, and I'm going to look at the governors in the engine there that are actually making decisions about what the engine should do. And this had a lot of influence on people in the 19th century. And then, of course, it had a lot of influence on Turing. Well, could a machine play chess? And then later people, can a machine translate? Now, if every time the machine is doing these things, it's slicing something away from us that we used to think of as uniquely ours. The notion of the atomic human is what can't be cut. What I'm trying to do there is take a reductionist notion to looking at something and then say, therefore complexity. Therefore reductionism doesn't work. Because one of the problems I face, I'm quite into reductionist approaches. As an engineer, it's useful. And I would primarily say I'm probably an engineer. As a scientist, I find it interesting. But the misapplication of these approaches has reached off-the-scale problematic levels. And so the attempt is to sort of say, so when it comes to sort of the analytic philosophy, I think that that's what you see a lot of that happening. It's like you make these statements at the beginning and you say, imagine this is true and that is true and this is true. And then you sort of come out with some set of consequences. And then you say, therefore, superintelligence. It's like, yeah, but the thing you said right at the beginning, that one intelligence can dominate another, is an utterly nonsensical idea because intelligence is multifaceted. And these notions of runaway intelligence and so-called singularity all rely on the eugenic notion of intelligence being like height, which is something that comes from Spearman and Francis Galton, and did not lead to a good place. It's all, all made in Britain, right? Eugenics, and all in the fear of a rising Germany, and programs of national efficiency and breeding people in the 1890s. And the people who were against it were often people from literature or religious backgrounds, and the people who were so in favor of it were all the scientists, the quantitative people. And that failure of reductive thinking, in terms of like, that's better than that, therefore this is going to happen, therefore Germans will outcompete us, therefore we have to start breeding people, is really deeply problematic, because society is much more, and life is much more complex, and biology is much more complex than that. So when it comes to the analytic philosophy, I think you see the same thing going on. But I do think that, within philosophy, there's also the antidote for this. There's a lot of techniques for thinking, not all of them Western, that I'm not deeply familiar with, and a lot of ways of thinking. I try and reference Popper and Kuhn, and Popper in two different ways, both for his science, but also for his notions of open society, which are much more sophisticated. I think that just the challenge is, of course, the more sophisticated notions, they struggle to make headlines. So it's not so much the philosopher's fault. It's just the way we are as human beings. We need these things to be summarized in some simplistic way. And it's always going to be a problem for us, that things that are very vivid and predictions, and if you ask Nick about it, he's a very nice person. He would say, I didn't want people to do that. But, that is what's going to happen if you make these sort of statements, because that's what gets reported on. And that's what occupies people's minds rather than the true sophistication and the true sort of problems that humans face.
That last point, I find it's fascinating that there's often a principle that applies both at the level of what we're talking about and at the meta level about our discourse about it. And here's another one. It's this idea that the simplest hypothesis is most likely to be true. And a lot of machine learning operates that way, and it tries to regularize and minimize and cut down the number of parameters and still account for the data. And so we also think that if a philosophical position, say, is what you were considering, if it's easy to state and slogan-esque, then, yeah, that must be right. Whereas we tend to yawn and roll our eyes at the philosopher who takes a little more time to express her position or his position. Is that an interesting
it's super
observation,
interesting.
Or is it?
No,
is
and I
it
think
just
it is.
A distraction?
And one of the things I hope we can get to, and I don't think we're going to get to it anytime soon, is that I think eventually out of this technology, if we make good decisions, we will get to something that similar to what happened with literature. The evolution of the novel. Like the early days of the printing press, it's not particularly nice what happened. Everyone starts killing each other because they believe in different variants of God. And everyone says, and then Renaissance and Enlightenment. He said, yeah, okay, but a lot of people died. A lot of people died around arguments that were about their cultural predispositions.
Of course, that happened before the printing press, but your point is that the printing press amplified it. Or
Yeah, I mean, well, the printing press, it challenges existing authorities. It undermines the power in Europe of the Catholic Church, which was abusing that power, arguably, in some areas. And so it's rightly criticized for that. But, in a sense, those were the institutions of the time that lent security to society. So we might look back at it and say, what a terrible position to be in as a sort of peasant, being subjugated by the church. But it's a pretty arrogant, and we do the same thing talking about African states today and go on and sort of impose our notions of democracy. Whereas, my colleagues, when I visit Africa, almost universally, their first and most important thing to them is security. That they can reliably feed their family and go about their daily business without getting killed. It's a great privilege to have started worrying about democratic freedoms. And what you see happens with the development of the printing press is, that those securities are destabilized. And what you see happening exactly now with these technologies is our securities and our institutions being destabilized. And I don't want to claim that every institution is perfect. No institution will ever be perfect. But that's why Popper's interesting, because he sort of says, well, yeah, but the institutions have to be able to assimilate and evolve. The alternative of coming and doing away with these institutions in the belief that you know better is always leads to totalitarianism and tyranny. And that's what we're experiencing right now, across the world. And I worry that is going to be something that is difficult to stop. But in the long term, you get culturing emerging around these information ecosystems. And I'm not an expert in it, but I think it's a fascinating thing that when you get things like satire and the culture of the novel and, what's going on in Swift with Gulliver's Travels, that he's making fun of people in society, but there's an art form emerging around this. And there are ideas that that I think are particularly interesting because they're secular. Up until then, almost all those lifting ideas are in some way associated with religion or some sacredity. But actually, the novel allows secular ideas to arise. And one of the things we're doing at the moment is kind of destroying it, right? It's being undermined. And so I think the hope is that we can rapidly get to a point where this communication system, this new way of operating, the AI, is being leveraged in that interest in lifting our thinking. But it's a constant problem that the first thing it does, the easiest way to make money is not to lift people's thinking. It's to debase them. It's to sort of, plug into, their sexual desires or their in-group, out-groupness or whatever else. And that's not even if people in Silicon Valley, they don't have to be evil for that to happen. As soon as you do the optimization algorithm and you do something too simplistic, that's what happens. The complexity emerges later. And I think that is the fascinating thing, because I don't know for anyone who's into science, and I'm super into uncertainty and entropy, there's a principle that's the maximum entropy principle that is one of the most universal principles, that allows you to show a load of physics. So, and what it sort of says is, okay, there might be a simple rule, but what emerges from the simple rule is a myriad complexity in terms of the way of interacting. And so even if you know the simple rule, it doesn't allow you to predict what's going to happen in the complex evolved system. And that's where we're at. So although we're slow communicating, the machine looking at me talking to you now and watching the rate of communication is equivalent to, and I can't see any other life forms apart from humans, but it's equivalent to me watching you evolve and become another species, or watching a tree turn into another species, right? So the rate of information that is passed down genetically to the next generation, the maximum rate, the speed at which that happens, that's there, we're here, and the machine is there, right? So if you want to sort of conceive of how much faster the machine is than us, it's so much faster that it's equivalent to us watching grass evolve, not grow, evolve. That's kind of mind-blowing. But one of the interesting things you get out of that, because of this entropy thing, the complexity associated with environmental systems is off the charts, because they've been running in parallel at scale across the whole planet for 2.5 billion years or more, at least 2.5 billion years. So that co-evolution going all the way back to the forming of the eukaryote cell 2.5 billion years ago, 350 million years ago, to us emerging from the seas as, developing feet sort of thing, to our sort of separation from the apes, whatever that is, 9 million years ago. The amount of learnings that are in our genomics, but actually also embedded in our behavioral systems and our cultural patterns, is myriad off the charts complex. So although we're way slower than the machine, and this also applies, you can use this to think about environmental issues. So if you want to think about the challenges that the planet's facing, it's facing challenges because we're coming in and making decisions to burn coal up at the Engineerium that, from the planet's perspective, is like a smack in the face because it's 200 years. And it took whatever it was, millions and millions of years for the carbon to be taken out of the atmosphere. When oxygen was initially released 2.5 billion years ago, it poisoned the whole planet. But the planet adapted to that over millions and millions of years. Eukaryotic cells emerged in response to that, right? But if you put the carbon back in across 200 years, that's kind of equivalent to releasing Facebook overnight or ChatGPT. That's the equivalent disruption. So when we think about these sort of social disruptions, I think that notions of our culture being poisoned, by these technologies in the same way we potentially poison our atmosphere is the way to think about it. And they are very real threats and very difficult to predict because despite this simplicity, the downstream complexity of the emergent ecosystems, what will be the equivalent of the novel? And, there is hope. Wikipedia is already an interesting emerged phenomenon, right? What's going to be the equivalent of Wikipedia that lifts our thinking, hopefully, in AI? I don't know. No one can design it. But the things we do find easy to design are things that that effectively debase people and make someone a lot of money, but they don't do a lot for our overall culture.
In a way, some things you say make the outlook bleak. Are there educational strategies we can engage in to make the atomic human more resistant to being exploited or manipulated or have a better understanding of its relationship to the rest of the world? What are some of the possible solutions? Give us some hope.
Well, I think, first of all, I don't know if this is how hopefully you'll find this. I'm a total optimist. And but I have a sort of partial reason. You have to be optimistic because pessimism is self-fulfilling. That actually, you can look at humans and say, why are they so optimistic? Why do they keep believing things will work out? When, actually, I think there's a lot of, you know more about this than me, but there's a lot of evidence. But there's something great
about being self-fulfilling, because then you're right? Isn't it nice to be right?
And yeah, we have those people. That's another thing I sometimes say, is the reason I'm an optimist is I can rely on everyone else to tell me what's wrong with something. Oh, right. But there's, the reason why optimism does work, there's an enormous communication overhead to collaboration. And collaboration in the sense of, if you're trying to collaborate to distort the world or manipulate the world, then you have to constantly remind each other what you're doing. Now, yes, there are systems that we have that enable that, and I think that those systems have good sides. The problem is that they go too far. So market economies do all sorts of interesting things in distributing information. It's just when power concentrates too much. And ironically, we already understand that. We've just abandoned a lot of those lessons in the face of great wealth. But the reason we have to be optimistic is because pessimism is self-fulfilling. The other reason we have to be optimistic is when solutions do come, it's very rare. It's very rare that I can tell that it's obvious where the solution is going to come from. It normally comes from left field. There's something you weren't thinking about. Early social media where you had Wikipedia and there's like, I don't know, Foursquare, all these other things. Many of them have fallen by the wayside. Who would know that which one's going to succeed, right? So a lot of what we're doing is things that are in our culture and need to be celebrated better, like educating the next generation and educating them around values and what it is to care for each other. Things that, we're increasingly seeing being diminished or devalued in our national conversations. It's appalling how little we are talking about the crisis in education in this country at the moment. Yes, talk about growth. Yes, we need growth. But we're talking about a very serious situation across all levels of education. Yes, we know there's no money, that there's more money in the bloody money act than there is in our treasury. But you can pull people together with shared ideas and shared values about who we are and who we're trying to be and what we're trying to achieve. And that's why we can be optimistic, because people will do that on their own. People do enjoy being in communities. They do enjoy sharing. When they're given time to think these things, these aspects that we're talking about that social media gives, it doesn't fulfill people. There are gaps in their lives. We've got an increasing suicide rate. There are a number of things that we can do if we treasure these human aspects of ourselves more. The challenge is they're difficult to quantify. So what you see is, enormous conversations about GDP as a growth measure, whereas my colleague Diane Coyle, who I had breakfast with this morning, has just written a very good book, The Measure of Progress, pointing out how useless GDP is as a growth measure and how we need to move beyond that and think more creatively. Now, I don't think there's much sign of that at the moment, and I think one of the really depressing things we see politically is the failure of, I'm definitely a centre, open society, sort of liberal type person, but I have to say there's just abject failure from the centre to give any answers at the moment, which is a desperate situation, because all we're hearing is the same repeat answers we heard 20 years ago that got us into these situations. And that's why populism is rising, because they're providing answers. But, yes, I don't know about next year. I worry about my kids or whatever. But what I do have faith in is how extraordinarily adaptive and robust we are as a human species, and how much that relies on us as individuals to deliver on this, that our role is there. And one of the problems is that the current wave of digital technologies, as we see in the Horizon scandal, has been a wave of technologies that have disempowered individuals. In Horizon, disempowering the sub-postmasters, disempowering the accountants that were supposed to protect them, the lawyers that were supposed to protect them, and the politicians that were supposed to protect them, because a monolithic digital system was failing. Now, there is a massive opportunity, and it's an extraordinary opportunity with this next wave of generative AI technologies to put that right, because for the first time ever, anyone in this room can talk to a computer and have the computer understand what they mean. And that is mind-blowing, right? But the battle we're now facing is who controls that power. And obviously there's risks with that power, because it's not just the people in this room, it's people, nefarious purposes. But the real challenge we face now is to try and ensure that as that power is distributed in a way that ensures that those people who are working together towards those better goals are empowered and not undermined, because the first wave of digital technologies has undermined them. If you read Kuhn on scientific revolutions, and one of the points he made, then he has the notion of a scientific paradigm, and of course it's about paradigm shifts, which is very interesting. But one of the things I'm trying to extract from that is he says that scientific knowledge, the paradigm, is stored in textbooks, right? And he sort of says before the 19th century it was written in Principia and Newton's books, but 19th century it's stored in textbooks, 20th century stored in textbooks. Today, scientific paradigms are stored in computers. They are not stored in books. That means that most people can't access them. That means that ridiculous situation we had with Neil Ferguson with his pandemic simulation and all that code, that no one knew what was going on inside. Even he didn't know what was going on inside, right? Because instead of it being a simple SCIR model, the differential equation that most public health people would be familiar with its limitations, it's some massive piece of code that actually took years to go through and find all sorts of bugs when they did eventually make it available. That's deeply problematic. I mean, I think the character is called Jo Holloway in the dramatization of Horizon, while she's trying to reconcile her accounts, and of course it's a dramatization, but live, more money she's becoming more in debt in front of the computer, and she screams at the computer, stop. The computer can't understand. But today, the computer could. We could build computers that could understand and could say, oh, yeah, no, you're totally right. This is weird. Or, oh, hang on a minute. Neil Ferguson's model doesn't actually include face masks as a possible intervention, which I'm not sure if it was Neil Ferguson. Certainly some of the models didn't include them. These are the things that become very obvious to people, and that we can actually see again what is in these machines and actually start to sort of steer them better, rather than being controlled by them, which is already the situation we're in. That the digital technologies have become detached enough from us. We just the computer says no, so therefore we have to do what the computer says. But I think there's an amazing opportunity with this next wave.
So, being able to talk to our information processing systems in natural language is certainly revolutionary. On the other hand, it seems that sometimes there might not be transparency like we want, but sometimes there's the illusion of transparency. So sometimes these models, at least as they currently are, they will tell you how they got to their conclusions, or they'll even, while they're doing their calculations, tell you what they're doing. And some of that is just more predicted text. It has no causal connection to what steps it actually went through in order to come up with that conclusion, some of the time at least.
Yeah.
And it's just something, it's just more, this is the kind of thing you say when somebody asks you how you got to your conclusion. Yeah. Well, the language model says this is the kind of thing you should say, instead of actually looking at what was actually done in the last few milliseconds or hundreds of milliseconds, whatever. So for every solution, it seems like there are more perils ahead.
The two themes that I've shifted my research group to, one is that interface, and the other is the interface between the LLM and the digital data itself, like the code base or whatever else it's looking at. Because
co-pilots and things like that.
Yeah, well, things like because. Right, so you know, you imagine you've got Neil Ferguson's code base, which is now on GitHub, and I start questioning it, and it's saying what's in there, or isn't there? There's lots of ways things could go wrong, but in my head, I'm dividing the ways in which we're looking at the ways things that could go wrong. Is one, it not actually having a sort of full view of the code base, like the mapping between the code itself and the LLM, which is taking that as inputs as text, right? But of course, the code has multiple representations. It can be represented as graph. That's somehow not picking up the nuances of the things we need to talk about. So that's interface one, how it goes from the code into the neural network. And then there's the other interfaces you're sort of saying, like how I interface as a human being with that. But I find that fascinating in itself because, of course, it's also what humans do. You know, that it has learned this from us, all this hallucination, or bullshitting. It just comes from us, right? That's what people do. It's just people have this perception that a machine won't do it. But actually the machine, people have to do it because, of course, we don't know everything. So what we do is we sort of we just embellish a little bit, right? And this is, famously eyewitness accounts. You'll know much more about this than me. But if things happen too quickly, you'll start to fill in the gaps, and you will utterly believe that this series of things happened, right? Because it's your model takes over from what you could have seen in the world. This is one reason I think I describe it in the book, a cycle accident I went through, where all these things feel like they went through my head, but they didn't. They didn't go through my head. Things happened way too quickly for that to be true. I felt I was making all these conscious decisions, but what was really going on is I was reacting in the moment, and then retrospectively I was telling a story to myself, because the alternative is that, as you're about to go into an accident, the general that is your conscious brain that thinks it's in charge is basically thrown away to one side. We're ignoring everything we're saying. We're just going to get you out of this situation. But you don't then at the end of that feel that, because that would freak you out. So you sort of tell the general sort of things, yes, happened because of this, and I had this plan in place, and the general tells themselves that that's what's going on. So when we see that in the machine, that's what we're getting. We're getting these retro explanations. And what I think is fascinating about that, and I'm not deeply familiar with the literature, but there's a lot of knowledge that these explanations work. If you take two clinicians and you convene them correctly, if you convene them incorrectly, it goes very wrong, as we know from pilots and all sorts of things. But if you convene them correctly to have a conversation about a patient that they have shared knowledge of, they will leave with a better understanding of that patient's disease, even though they're not exchanging numbers. In fact, it can be problematic when you start trying to convert these things into numbers and probabilities. Humans struggle with that. We share uncertainty in ways through language that is very different from the ways that we've had to learn to construct uncertainty so far. So there's an enormous new frontier in terms of what it means for the machine to talk to us in certain ways, and what it means in different contexts, and how it shares its picture of the world. I think you're right. A lot can go wrong in that space. But I think that on the upside, if we do this stuff well, and unfortunately that means doing things we're not doing at the moment, like getting access to these models, celebrating people who are doing genuine academic work, not just people who are sort of, churning out billions and all the other stuff we need, and getting fields to work across together. It's not like universities are always good at this. Actually Sussex, and cognitive science here was one of the first places to look at these things as an interdisciplinary field, right? But it's not like over the years we've celebrated that. It's still a standout place in that. You don't get great rewards from being pioneers in that. So celebrating that sort of interdisciplinary work, because it actually turns out to, I think, be also a vital piece about understanding that conversation between two doctors as well. We suddenly have a new set of tools to understand how two doctors might be sharing information, and we can potentially feed that back into how the machine's doing it. But
we've actually had I'm sad to say, a very poignant reminder of Sussex pioneering role in this area with just a few days ago, the passing of Professor Margaret Bowden.
Oh, I didn't know she died.
So I just thought,
she was amazing.
So she was
I met
an
her
important figure in this field.
And I was on the AI, the Royal Society review with her. Yeah, and an extraordinary figure who was here at Sussex. Yeah, no, that's very sad to hear. I
don't
realize,
mean to bring the tone down
or
interrupt you, but I just thought...
Also, there are other people who she knew very well, like Yorick Wilkes, who've died recently. So ironically, the generation, and I don't mention Maggie in the book, but I talk about that era when there was, which Maggie and Yorick and others who, this generation who are now dying. And we are, ironically, the foundations of what they did and said, how things should be done, is the thing that's become successful now. The people who were, Sam Alton doesn't know who Maggie Bowden is, right? But those who've traced what's going on, and it was their community who was willing to sort of look across philosophy, psychology, computer science, and these areas. That's where cognitive science comes from. And that is sort of the founding field of these neural network methods. So, getting back to, there's an immense opportunity to get back to those methods and to sort of have a renaissance in cognitive science with a whole set of tools that just were not available to that generation. But what a world it would have been had they had these tools, because they were so much more imaginative than today's generation, in terms of their ideas. And that's often what happens when you bring disciplines together.
So I'd like to finish by moving away from the topics that we've been discussing and instead talk about the book itself. And, without embarrassing you, I hope, just to say it was delightful to read it, because it's not a dry academic book about these topics. There's a lot in there about history, about culture, it's written in a witty way. I just wanted to mention that, and then see if you wanted to finish by saying something about the process of writing, or what's next, or something that's more about you and your relationship to the book rather than what you discussed in the book.
Yeah, I mean, it was a great privilege to write, and it's a great privilege to hear you say that. And not everyone enjoys it, because I think it is quite a personal book. And that is very intentional, because I thought, well, how absurd to write about these ideas and not put some of your person in it and give permission. It's trying to sort of give permission to people to do that. But I did sort of enjoy doing that. And I think the favorite comment I had from one of my students, she said, well, it's like talking to Neil, but you can put it down, which is it's like even better than talking to Neil, because you can decide when you've had enough.
Pause.
Pause, precisely. I need to do something now.
Well, we do actually. We do have to pause now. But thank you so much. Let's all thank Neil for his presentation this evening.
Thank you.